Assalamu alaikum, dear students. How are you? And welcome back, I guess. Seems like I convinced you from the last lecture that public finance is a very important field, and that might be one of the reasons that you are here. Or maybe secondly, this course is very important for you and you have to pass this, that's why you're here, whatever. But the point is, just remember the fact that the students who are really interested in the concept are much better performers during the course and during the exam. So it is very important that you develop the understanding based on the concepts rather than just getting it off your head. Welcome to lecture number 2. In the last lecture, we discussed in great detail the subject of public finance. We discussed its definitions. Then we discussed that public finance is a very, very important field, and every action of the government not only has its effects on the aggregate level on the economy, but it affects welfare of every single individual, including yourself. So, having said that, we defined the scope of the public finance, in which we started with the functions of the government, that establishment of a government is very important, and not only because of its role as a police or its role for defense, but also correct certain market failures. And then we discussed that the effect of every policy by the government has its effect on the economic life, including the stabilization policy using fiscal measures and fiscal operations. And then we discussed that the role of the state and the scope of the public finance in terms of public revenue, public expenditure, fiscal policy, and public debt management. And then we also highlighted certain important areas that we would be covering through this course. So public finance is a very important topic to be covered. It is a branch of economics that has been realized to be of utmost importance for well-being of an economy. Now, there are different government structures operating in the world, like there are completely controlled economies, which are often called command economies. There are market-oriented economies, and there are mixed economies. Now, considering that fewer countries like former Soviet Union and for example Eastern Europe, they were command economies and the communist countries basically, and they had very controlled government environment in which actually the government decided what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. The three very basic questions of economics and around which the subject of economics revolves around. It is basically the management of scarce resources of production, factors of production and resources in economy. So the government would decide how to allocate those resources, which is one of the responsibilities of the government through different mechanisms, but in controlled economies, those are by direct decisions of the government, by direct intervention in the market system. Now, based on that, later, when it was observed that the more advanced or industrialized countries had much better standard of living than these command economies. So what was the reason? So it basically started with, it arose three questions, few questions, that what is about free markets, that they get most out of the production resources. And then can markets be relied upon to satisfy all the wants of the society? And when do markets fail to provide the necessary goods to its citizens or its economy? And how far does the profit motive goes to decide what goods to provide to its citizens, and what would be the negative side effects of the profit motives. Now, the command economies had a lower standard of living, and the industrialized economies with freer markets had a better standard of living. So that's why these few questions comes into mind of every economist, and that's why it was debated now. So that would mean, before going further, we need to evaluate the use of resources, or in other words, the efficient use of resources. So if we need to see or analyze the markets, and analyze the efficiency of the markets and efficiency of the market mechanism to decide the use of scarce resources in an economy, and only then we would be able to identify the defects in the markets, that if there are any distortions and if there are any errors in the market system, are there any failures, to be exact. Now, after the defects are identified, we see the need for the government intervention to provide the necessary goods and services. But all this revolves around the criteria based on which we need to evaluate the markets. Now, the free markets, through its higher outcomes, higher profit motive, might produce or might give most of the goods that are necessary for an economy or for its citizens, but then free markets cannot be relied upon to provide all the goods that are necessary, or to fulfill all the wants. And therein comes the government later to ensure the efficiency in production of goods and services, and therein the government would use means like taxes and subsidies to correct the market failures. So we need to study the markets first, we need to study the efficiency criteria first, and how do we evaluate a public policy. And then we would come towards how government can intervene in the market and what would be the effects of government intervention. Because if we go to the effects of the government intervention, not always the taxes and subsidies can cause efficiency in the market system. And further government intervention would be required in case of monopolies, for example, which might distort the efficient resource allocation. Now, going towards this, we need to see the two main evaluation criterias, or for example, how do we evaluate the public policy, the two main scientific approaches, and one of them is positive economics and the other one is normative economics. Positive economics is the field that it is about the facts and data and figures, and it just evaluates based on those facts and figures. It is basically what would be the effects of building of a road, for example, and how much cost it would reduce in terms of how much the actual building of road would cost, or construction of a road, and how much would it cost or reduce the cost of traveling and all that stuff. So it would be based on actual facts and figures, while the other analysis, or for example scientific approach, is normative economics, and it says it gives the recommendations on what should be. So positive economics is making without any judgments, it is what is on factual grounds, while normative economics is about what should be, not what is. Normative economics include value judgments or moral values in terms of analysis. For example, actually I had a case study, a very interesting case study that I read once, long time ago. It was about National Health Services in UK. And there was a girl who was dying of leukemia, and her treatment was very expensive. And National Health Agency, actually the insurance provider by the government, declined to give her those services, or to finance her medical treatment, on the grounds that she is at such a critical stage in that disease that all those expense would go to waste. Now, based on that, her father actually went to the court, and he filed a complaint, and he said, and her father's lawyer said that the girl has the right to live, and this would be very, she has right to life, and maybe even if there are 0.02% chances of her survival, the government should finance her treatment. While the lawyer of the agency argued that the girl is on the deathbed almost, so she cannot be treated like that, and since the National Health Services has very scarce resources, so treating her would mean that many of the other individuals cannot be treated. Now, do you see what is the difference in their arguments? The lawyer of the National Health Services is actually approaching the positive economic analysis or positive economic scientific approach to see that actually the resources are very scarce and they have less resources, and if they fund her treatment, they would not be able to fund treatments of other needy people. While the lawyer of her father, or who was giving arguments for the girl, was basically on the normative economics perspective. So one might argue on the basis of positive economic principle or normative economic principle to see the effects of a government policy. For example, if government starts to ensure to give for example subsidies or build cheaper homes for poor individuals at very cheaper rates, or maybe they build and rent it out at very cheaper rates, so people in lower income classes can have a reasonable accommodation, to have a roof over their heads, and that policy decision would be on normative economic perspective. But then if you evaluate that policy on the basis of positive economic perspective, you would also see that if in case for example, what if certain wealthy individuals or at least from the middle class or upper classes would vacate their homes and just shift to the cheaper accommodation built by the government. So you see, you already see a controversy over here. Or what if the government starts to make rent control in the economy, and they say that rent, they set the upper ceiling of rents, and they say that the rent cannot exceed this much amount. And what would be the effects of this policy? You know, for example, if that would deteriorate the availability of rental accommodation in a city, that would deteriorate the quality of the rental accommodation in the city. So from positive economic perspective, that again might be a very debatable question. So policies are not always which makes everyone happy. In fact, there are always controversies, and we'll discuss those controversies on our way towards through this lecture. Now, what about efficiency then? What is efficiency as such? Now, to evaluate the market structure, to evaluate the government intervention, to evaluate the effects of the policies, we need to see what efficiency would be, and this efficiency that we are going to discuss is basically derived on normative economic perspective. There was an economist in around by the end of 19th century or early 20th century by the name of Wilfredo Pareto, and he gave actually the efficiency criteria. Efficiency criteria is basically when one individual can be made better off without making the other individual worse off. So as written in the slide, the efficiency criteria is satisfied when resources are used over any given period of time in such a way as to make it possible to increase the well-being of any one person without reducing the well-being of the other person. Before we move further in our analysis of the government policies, first we need to establish this Pareto optimality and how to conduct the analysis under welfare economics. This is another field of economics which is related to evaluation of the policies of the government and public finance. Now, welfare economics is a very important field again, and we need to understand how we are going to evaluate the government policies later on. So for this we need to establish the efficiency criteria, because if establishing the criteria first is important, so that we have a benchmark and we know that how we are going to evaluate all the policies of the government. Now, to start with this, let us discuss the efficient use of resources. For this we have two main assumptions, that there are two inputs, there are only two inputs, and capital and labor, and there are only two outputs being produced in the economy, which is food and clothing. Now, since there are only two items being produced in the economy, or two goods being produced, which are food and clothing, then each of those goods have their own production function. Now, for food, the production function is represented by F is a function of labor that is being utilized for the production of food, and capital that is being utilized for the production of food. And clothing, which is represented by C over here, is a function of the labor that is being utilized under for production of clothing, and capital, which is being utilized for production of clothing. Now, there are only two production functions because there are only two goods, and one of the constraints is that they are going to use there is full employment, so all the labor that is available in that economy is either going towards the production of food or going towards the production of clothing, and that is represented by the total labor over here. And then capital is again going towards production of the total capital is fixed, and that is going towards the production of food or going towards the production of clothing. Now, the productive efficiency is basically that it is not possible to reallocate inputs to alternative uses in such a manner as to increase the output of any good without the resource, without reducing the output of some alternative good. That represents that the factors of production are in fixed supply, and since they are in fixed supply, they are either being used for the production of food, and they are being used for the production of clothing. Now, if we switch, for example, just labor from production of food to production of clothing, that would reduce the quantity of food being produced, or units of food being produced. So economy would be operating at the most efficient level if this criteria is satisfied of production efficiency. Now, for this, to analyze the scenario, we have an Edgeworth's box. It is one of the very important analysis which we conduct to see the productive efficiency criteria in an economy. For this, we have on the x-axis at the bottom is labor being utilized for the production of food, and the top x-axis we have labor being utilized for production of clothing, and on the right y-axis we have capital being utilized for production of clothing, and on the left we have capital being utilized for production of food. So these are basically two types of goods being produced, as I already said, food and clothing. Now, to see what would be the efficient allocation of these resources, we have so many isoquants. Isoquants are basically, iso stands for equal and quant stands for quantity. Isoquants is a convex curve which is convex towards the origin, and it tells you it gives you the various combinations of labor and capital that would be producing the same quantity. So if you look at the figure, the food origin is at the bottom left corner of the slide, and the clothing origin is the top right hand of the slide. So let us consider only the food part right now, which is the bottom x-axis and the y-axis on the left side. Now the isoquant of food is represented by F1, F2, F3, F4 and F6 and F5, of course. The isoquant is convex to the origin. The other isoquant, which is in the opposite direction, is for clothing. So we are only focusing right now on the isoquant, which is for the food. Each isoquant represents a specific quantity of food being produced. F1 represents a certain quantity of food. F3 again represents another quantity of food, which is, since it is outwards towards the right, is showing a higher quantity of food, and that is why it is requiring more factors of production in terms of labor and capital. Now I hope you understand the concept of isoquant. This Pareto efficiency would require certain microeconomic analysis, which you might need to understand this in order to understand the productive efficiency, in order to understand the Pareto optimality. We need to understand these concepts. So it is very important that you understand the isoquants first. Isoquant, again I would repeat, isoquant is a convex curve. Iso means same, quant means quantity. It would mean same quantity. So one single isoquant, maybe it is F3 over here, represents a same quantity of food that can be produced by different combinations of factors of production. Now along an isoquant, that would mean the factors of production can be substituted for each other. Maybe you can produce something with 10 units of capital and 3 units of labor. So if you forego 2 or 3 units of capital, now you have 8 units of capital. Now with that, you can increase the units of labor and you would still produce the same quantity. It would be just like if you are building a 100-kilometer road. You can use like maybe 3 big machines and you can build that road in a few days, and you just need like maybe 20 units of labor or 30 units of labor, 10 on each machine. But then maybe if you reduce the number of big machines to build that road, you would need to increase the number of units of labor that you employ to produce that 100 kilometers road. Now you see that this 100 kilometers road, the quantity that is being produced per unit time is same. You are substituting between capital and labor. So if you are substituting between capital and labor, the one isoquant would represent the 100 kilometers of road with 2 different combinations. So one single isoquant might represent lots of combinations of labor and capital, which would be producing the same quantity of any output that you are producing. In this case, specifically in this case, we are talking about only 2 goods that are being produced. One of them is food and the other one is capital. I hope you understand the concept now. It's not that difficult. It just needs a little understanding of microeconomics and some focus and some interest in the subject. That is always very important. So if you grasp the concept over here, it would remain there for the lifetime. But if you just like go through it to pass the exam, it would be vanished in like maybe 50 minutes or 30 minutes after the exam. So we need to focus on the concept. I would recommend you just go through, because this is not the scope of this course. I'm just giving you an overview of isoquants. I recommend that you go through, just type isoquant and look for it and get a book, or maybe just look through the notes. Maybe you'd find some help in that. But the concept is exactly the same which I explained. So now in this Edgeworth's box, we have 2 goods, food and clothing. And food's origin is on the bottom left of this box, and the clothing origin is on the top right of the Edgeworth's box. Now you can see different isoquants. The isoquants are convex, of food are convex to the origin on the left side. They are curves which are convex. You can see that represented by F1, F3, F4, F6, F5. and the isoconts of clothing are convex to the top right of the Edgeworth box, and they are represented by C1, C3, C4, C5, C6 and C2 over here. Now the whole point is, if you look at this again, concentrate on it, there are certain points at which the quants of both the goods are tangent to each other. Now, and there are certain other points at which they just intersect each other. Now let's assume, first look at the point Z1, which is represented by Z1. Now this Z1 is intersection of C2 and F4, both of these isoconts for food and clothing. C represents clothing, F represents food. Now if that is the intersection, that would mean that there are other ways of efficiently allocating these resources to produce the same quantity. Let's for example, you can also produce at Z star and E star. Z star and E star would be more efficient points, because at Z1 you can produce the same quantity of clothing and the same quantity of food, yet move to a more efficient point, and in fact you can move to a better quantity of food without reducing the quantity of clothing. So this Edgeworth box, the line starting from O to O prime across the diagonal through the box, represents all the efficient combinations. There are so many efficient combinations which are represented by tangency of the isoconts. You must understand that in terms of clothing, the isocont which are further away from the origin of clothing produce a higher quantity of clothing, and the isocont which are further away from the origin of food represent a higher quantity of production of food. So F4 or F5 or F6 represent a greater quantity of food being produced than F1 or F2 or F3. Same is the case with clothing. Now C1 represents the lowest most quantity being produced in terms of clothing, and C6 represents the maximum or highest quantity of clothing being produced. So the farther away from the origin these isoconts are, the more quantity they represent. Now look at this graph. If for example again we see at the point of intersections, which is Z1, it is between F4 and C2. Now this is not an efficient point. Why? Because in terms of C2, F4 is producing some quantity of food. Now that same quantity of food can be produced at Z prime, plus instead of C2 we can move on to C3. That represents a higher quantity of clothing being produced. So that Z star is more efficient than Z1. Why? Because the quantity of food is same, F4, but the quantity of clothing that is being produced is greater than C2, which is greater. So we are increasing the quantity of one good without reducing the quantity of the other good. So that point where we can do that, Z star and E star and all these tangency points, those are more productively efficient points. That is productive efficiency, and that represents productive efficiency. One more thing, that along an isocont, along a curve which is convex to the origin, just one single isocont, there is substitutability between labor and capital, and that substitution between labor and capital is called marginal rate of technical substitution or marginal rate of transformation. So represented by MRTS of food and MRTS of clothing. So this again represents the substitutability between factors of production, and at those efficient points which we saw in the previous graph, where the two isoconts are tangent to each other, the two marginal rate of technical substitution of food and the marginal rate of technical substitution of clothing are equal to each other. So that line that was diagonal from the almost a diagonal from the Edgeworth box, starting from O to O prime, represented all those efficient combinations where marginal rate of technical substitution of food was equal to marginal rate of technical substitution of clothing. Now, all those efficient points can be represented on a production possibility frontier, which is being shown in the current slide. On the x-axis, there is clothing per year being produced, and on the y-axis, there is number of food items being produced per year. The production possibility curve represented by t to t prime, exactly the curve, that represents all the efficient combinations which can be produced for an economy using all the available resources in the most efficient manner. So that line drawn as a diagonal between the O and O prime in the Edgeworth box is represented by T and T prime over here, and all the resources this line represents that, and all the points on it, for example E1, E2 and D, represents that all the resources are being completely utilized and for the production of units of food and the production of units of clothing. So if you want to switch from production of food, you need to let go certain units of clothing, and if you want to increase the units of clothing, you need to let go certain units of food, and that is represented by substitution between them. So point E1, for example, or maybe the point D represents C units of clothing and F units of food. Now if you move from D to E2 or E1, you would have to let go certain units of clothing to gain certain units of food. Now another point represented over here as A. A represents that you are producing below the efficiency or production possibility curve or below the efficiency level, and at point A, whatever the units of food and clothing are being produced, certain resources are going to waste, and you can improve the utilization of those resources by moving to E1 or E2. Now going towards the Pareto efficiency, we have discussed the productive efficiency. I hope you understand productive efficiency by now. Productive efficiency would be the resources are being utilized in the best possible manner, in such a case that if you want to change, you want to increase certain production of the other good, for example we had clothing and food. If you want to increase the units of food, you would have to let go certain units of clothing, because all the resources are being utilized for the production of each of these goods, and we only have two factors of production and a given technology. And in this analysis or in this discussion that we are doing, we need to have some assumptions to hold things constant when we discuss. So Pareto efficiency starts with preferences on consumption. There are two individuals, A and B, represented over here. There is utility of A, and that utility is a function of the units of food that he consumes or he or she consumes, and units of clothing that he or she consumes, which is represented by U sub A equal to U is a function of, the brackets represent the functions. Then the other individual B, their preferences are also shown. The utility of the person B is a function of U and is a function of the number of units of food being consumed by B and the number of units of clothing being consumed by B. Now there are certain constraints involved in this, since there is only two goods and they are being produced in a fixed amount, and that goes back to when we have fixed amount of capital and labor, and all that capital and labor, when utilized efficiently in terms of productive efficiency, they produced a certain amount of food and they produce a certain amount of clothing. So the total food consumption in the economy would be the food consumed by A plus the food consumed by B, and similarly the total units of clothing consumed would be clothing consumed by A plus the clothing consumed by B. A similar Edgeworth's box would represent you see within this graph there is production possibility frontier that we discussed earlier, T and T prime. Now just ignore that for a moment and focus on the box which is represented by O, C, D and F. This graph is again an edge-verse box of the two individuals A and B. A is on the left half of or the origin represented by 0 on the left side, bottom left of the slide is A, and the units of food being consumed are represented on left side y-axis, which is foods, which is represented by FA. On the bottom x-axis there is clothing units consumed by C. Similarly, the D point represents at this moment as the origin for the individual B, and the top x-axis represents the units of clothing being consumed by C, and the right y-axis represented by D to C is y-axis showing the food units being consumed by B. Now all these curves that you see on the screen are actually the indifference curves. Indifference curves are a similar concept like isochords. Indifference curves show the preferences of an individual in terms of consumption. It is assumed all an individual needs is ranking of the goods, and in this case we just assume that there are two units, two types of goods, food and clothing. Now by combination, by making market baskets, different market baskets of food and clothing, an individual might attain a similar utility. For example, if he consumes 5 units of food in a week and 3 units of clothing, he might, let's call it U1, the level of utility that he receives, and the same level of utility might also be received by, for example, 3 units of food and 4 units of clothing. Now this indifference curve represents indifference of the individual, because all individuals need is to maximize their utility. Now when they maximize their utility, they do not bother about the units of the good that they are producing, but the total utility that they derive from the consumption of those goods. So an indifference curve represents all the combinations of goods which give, or all market baskets which give same level of utility to an individual. In this graph, if we look at it, there are an indifference curve. The word indifference typically represents the indifference of the individual among the different combinations of two goods, based on the fact that he derives a similar level of total utility out of it. So there are, if we consider the individual A, whose origin is on the bottom left side of the slide, UA1 represents his utility level A1. UA2 represents his utility level, second utility level. UA3 represents the third utility level, and so on. U1 is at lower level of utility, and every indifference curve that is to the right in case of A or away from the origin represents a higher level of utility. So from UA1 to UA7, the level of utility for the individual is increasing. Same is the case with the other individual B, whose origin is at point D, and his food units are on y-axis on the right side of the slide, and his units of clothing consumed are on the top x-axis represented by CB. Now his indifference curves are represented by UB1, UB2, so on up to UB7. I hope you understand the concept of indifference curve, and that they are convex to the origin. Now since the origin of individual B is on the top right of the slide, or maybe the point D, that's why his indifference curves are convex in that direction of the origin. UB1 to UB2 to UB3 represents an increasing level of total utility. So at point UB7 he would have the highest level of utility than UB1. Looking at this graph, there are few points represented. For example, there is an intersection point between UA4 and UB3. You can have a look at that. Now this point of intersection represents that not an efficient amount of allocation, because they can improve their consumption. Maybe, for example, if they move to E star, the total utility level of A would remain at UA4, but the total utility of individual B would increase to UB4. The concept is again the same. The point of tangencies are the most efficient points, and the line starting from O to D represents all those efficient allocations between the two individuals for the two consumers. Again, E and E star and E double star represents the two efficient combinations, and these efficient combinations, the two one individual cannot be made better off without making the other one worst off. While at the point of intersection, which was discussed earlier, for example, at the point of intersection below E star between UA4 and UB3, represented over here, is not an efficient point. So at this point, individual B can be made better off without making individual A worst off. Individual A is not being worst off because he is staying at his original utility level, and he is indifferent across all these combinations of clothes and food units, while individual B is jumping from a lower indifference curve UB3 to a higher indifference curve UB4, and he is being made better off than the individual at his previous state, from his previous state. So this would be an efficient allocation in terms of allocation of goods or distribution of goods. Now efficiency criteria on consumption and production are again associated to each other. If you move along an indifference curve, there is marginal rate of substitution. Marginal rate of substitution is the utility actually one has to forego by losing units of food, for example, which is on y-axis, and gain certain units of utility by gaining the units of clothing. So in order to stay on the same indifference curve, individual has to let go certain units of food to gain certain units of food, so that he stays on the same indifference curve. Otherwise he would jump to a higher indifference curve, just like in our previous example the individual did in case of for example, the individual B jumped from UB3 to UB4, while the individual A stayed on the same indifference curve. Now if you look at this efficiency criteria, and if you again go to the slide, all these combinations represented between O and D are the efficient combinations, and then E star represents the quantity of the distribution between an efficient distribution between the two individuals. And if this efficient distribution between two individuals is equal to the marginal rate of transformation or the marginal rate of technical substitution, then this would be an efficiency in case of consumption and production. Okay, now interpretation of the efficiency criteria, we need to define few terms, or maybe one or two terms, which is marginal benefit and marginal social benefit, or marginal benefit or private benefit, marginal private benefit. Now in this case, when we convert a benefit into monetary terms, that we would call a marginal social benefit or marginal private benefit if we're talking about one single individual. Now suppose we say that price of a unit of clothing is $1, then clothing is the same as money. we can then say that marginal rate of substitution, which we discussed earlier in terms of indifference curve, is A's willingness to substitute clothing for money, how much he would buy it for. What we have done is we have assumed again price of unit of clothing is $1, and we are treating the other good as food as money. Now in this case, marginal benefit of the individual would be his willingness to substitute clothing for the money. The same is true for B. Now if these are equal to the marginal rate of transformation, then this represents the capability of turning money into clothing as well. Now thus it reflects the cost of production. Lastly, if there are no other people who gain from either A or B consuming clothing or food, then because since we assumed that there are two individuals in our economy we have made, the marginal social benefit would be equal to marginal benefit to A and marginal benefit to B, which would be equal to marginal social cost, which would be the efficiency criteria. Now in terms of efficiency in Pareto optimality in perfect markets, now in perfect markets or perfect competition, remember that we assume that there is perfect information or complete information. There are large numbers of producers and there are large numbers of small scale buyers. Both these producers and buyers are price takers and they cannot influence each other, and there is because they are all small scale buyers, they compete each other within equal standing. So this type of a market in which this kind of an environment exists is called perfect competition. Plus we also assume in it that there is homogeneous product and there is free entry and exit in the market. Now all these assumptions constitute a perfect market. Now starting with that, efficiency in economic institutions, first we will discuss the perfect markets and Pareto optimal outcome in perfect markets. Now let's assume that capital and labor has a price on them. The production of a particular amount of good is efficient. The total budget required to produce a good by a firm at a given isocont it represents the price of capital, the payment that they need to make, plus the price of labor, the payment that they need to make to the labor, and that would be the total cost of production. Now moving on towards this cost minimization and productive efficiency, we have an isocont which is represented by F producing certain quantities of food. On x-axis there is labor, this is one single isocont, and then on y-axis there is capital. Now both of these can be utilized to produce along this green line a specific amount of food, which is F1 represented as F1 over here. Then there are certain lines going through it from y-axis to x-axis, from capital to labor, and all these lines are isocosts. Isocost represents the similar cost which can hire different combinations of labor and capital. So at this point, at point E, the second isocost from the origin is intersecting with the isocont, which represents the minimum cost at which the quantity F1 can be produced. Now you can see that F1 also intersects isocost number 3 from the origin, and that isocost represents at that intersection point, you can see that the same quantity can be produced at a lower isocost, which is the isocost number 2 from the origin. So that means that that would be the cost minimizing or productive efficiency, in which you are producing F1 at a lower cost rather than at a higher cost. So what is the implication of this figure? Marginal rate of technical substitution for food is equal to the price ratio of labor by price of labor as a ratio of price of capital, or these two ratio of price of labor and price of capital in simpler words, which was represented by this figure, the efficient point represented by E in the previous graph. A same graph can be shown for marginal rate of technical substitution of clothing, and that would again be the price of labor that is being used for production of clothing, and price of capital that is being used for production of clothing, and the ratio. Now so if marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to the ratio of prices, and marginal rate of technical substitution of clothing is equal to the ratio of prices, the efficient point would be at where marginal rate of technical substitution for food is equal to the marginal rate of technical substitution of clothing is equal to the ratio of prices of labor and capital. Now, how does this take us to Pareto efficiency in perfect markets? Now, so far we know from the previous from our understanding of perfect competition that price of profit maximizing firm under perfect competition produces where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Since all the firms are price takers, marginal revenue is also equal to price of the product. Now, so a firm producing food units would produce at the point where price of food would be equal to marginal cost of food, and the firm producing clothing would produce at the point where price of clothing would be equal to marginal cost of clothing. Now, from this figure you can see that it can be shown that the ratio of marginal costs would come up to be equal to the marginal rate of technical substitution, which we were discussing in the previous slide. So if we divide these two equations in the top lines of this slide, for example, PF is equal to marginal cost of F and PC is equal to marginal cost of C, and if we divide them, we would have the ratio of prices would be equal to the ratio of marginal cost of clothing and marginal cost of food. Now, marginal cost of food is the amount of other resources that must be given up to produce more food, since the labor or capital are in fixed quantity, as we discussed in the start, and productive efficiency would mean that in order to increase the more units of clothing, we need to forego certain units of food so that we can move the labor and capital producing food towards the firm which is producing clothing. Now, marginal cost of food would be equal to the change in number of clothing units, because we would be moving resources in that direction. It is the foregone clothing to produce more units of food. Now the same applies the other way around. Marginal cost of clothing is equal to the change in units of food. I repeat again that marginal cost of food is amount of the resources that must be given up to produce more food. If we want to increase the units of food, we would need to decrease the unit of clothing. Now if we divide these by each other, we get marginal cost of clothing divided by marginal cost of food, and which would be equal to change in number of food units divided by change in number of clothing units. Now coming towards the end, we need to establish the efficiency criteria in pure market. Now since change in units of food and divided by change in units of clothing, or the ratio, is equal to marginal rate of transformation or technical substitution between clothing and food, and this marginal rate of technical substitution or transformation between clothing and units of food is equal to their price ratio of clothing and food. If we equate these two equations, by the end we would come to the point where marginal cost of clothing and marginal cost of food would be equal to change in food units by change in clothing units would be equal to marginal rate of technical substitution between clothing and food, which would be equal to the ratio of the prices of clothing and food. So all this represents the efficiency criteria in terms of pure market. Now again, coming towards the consumer choice, we have an indifference map represented by only three. Indifference map usually has infinity number of indifference curves. infinite numbers of indifference curves, but over here we are having only 3 indifference curves, UA1, UA2 and UA3 for the individual A, which is intersecting, which is tangent to his budget line, the total amount of money that he has, which he is willing to spend on clothing and food. This this budget line is represented by AB over here. The underlying concept is same which we discussed in terms of ISO cost line. This AB represents the different combinations of food and clothing unit that he can afford, and the indifference curve represents the different combinations of food and clothing that would give him a same level of utility. So the point E represents the efficient point because of its tangency, because if you see, the budget line is also intersecting UA1 at 2 different points. Now if you choose any of these indifferent points, you would be at a lower utility level. So for a given budget line, an individual would strive to reach the maximum utility level, which is represented by E over here. Now, as we have just seen, the slopes of individual indifference curve are equal to the ratio of their prices, right? Marginal rate of substitution of A is equal to price ratio of clothing and food. Marginal rate of substitution of B is equal to the price ratio of C and F. So Pareto efficiency would mean the marginal rate of substitution of A would be equal to the marginal rate of substitution of B, would be equal to the marginal rate of transformation, would be equal to the price of clothing and price of food. Now, when the markets are imperfect, the scenario changes a little bit, because in case of perfect markets, we saw that the firm would produce at the point where marginal cost intersects marginal revenue, and that marginal revenue is same as price. But in case of imperfect markets, for example, in case of monopoly, monopoly would be producing where price is greater than marginal cost. Actually, it would be because the marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve. So marginal cost would intersect at marginal revenue. That is where they would decide the quantity, and from there they would see for the given quantity that benefits them, they would be charging the price which consumers are willing to pay. So the price would be greater than marginal cost. Now here comes an inefficiency in the production system, and then if we define this inefficiency as not Pareto optimal, then we would need to see the role of government. We have defined the Pareto efficiency through this whole analysis. We started from in terms of welfare economics. I did not give much time to this area because you would have already gone through in any simple course of microeconomics this sort of analysis, but I just needed to brush your memory through so that we can use this efficiency criteria, which we are going to discuss in our later lectures. If you look at this now, what we before I move on, I would like to summarize what we how we established the efficiency criteria. We used the normative economic perspective. There are basically 2 types of scientific analysis or scientific analysis: normative analysis and positive analysis. In positive analysis, we only use the facts and figures, while in normative economics we use value judgments and for example, basically value judgments. Now when we use value judgments, we see what it should be rather than what it is. When we move on from normative analysis, we started with welfare economics analysis. Welfare economics is a field of economics which uses normative analysis perspective and sees the efficiency criteria, which was made by an economist by the end of who was at the end of 19th century or in early 20th centuries, and that criteria was Pareto efficiency. Pareto efficiency is basically, in simple plain words, is when you cannot make one individual better off without making the other individual worse off. Starting with this, we started after this definition, we started with productive efficiency. Productive efficiency in a two good economy and two individual economy, where the factors of production and the consumption goods were fixed. We were only producing two units of two goods, food and clothing, and there were only individuals A and B for the consumption. Starting with that, we made a criteria for productive efficiency using an Edgeworth's box, which was a very good analysis where we see different isoconts intersecting each other at different points, and we defined that only efficient points would be those one where the two isoconts are intersecting, are tangent to each other. And why did we do that? Because we said that we cannot improve the number of units produced of one good without decreasing the number of units of two goods. So only if we can improve the number of units of produced of, for example, food units, without reducing the number of clothes units, we finding those points at the point of tangency, and those points of tangencies led to the efficient combinations, and those efficient combinations led to production possibility frontier of this economic system that we have created. Now that production possibility frontier represented the total number of food and clothing units that have to be substituted among each other, because as we said, that capital and labor that is used to produce these goods is in fixed numbers, and if we are producing efficiently and using all the resources in the most effective manner, we would be using, we cannot increase the food units without reducing the clothing units. So that came up with production possibility frontier. Then we came to Pareto efficiency in terms of an individual's analysis, when he derives satisfaction in terms of utility, and we established that an individual's utility level or an indifference curve represents the total utility that he derives from different combinations of food and clothing units. From there, we made an Edgeworth's box of the two individuals, and again we established, just like in case of production efficiency, we established that the points of tangency of the two indifference curves represents the points where no individual can be made better off without making the other individual worst off. Any other point where indifference curves might intersect, one of the individuals can be made better off without making the other individual worst off. So from there, deriving certain mathematical analysis in terms of microeconomics, we established a criteria that marginal rate of transformation or technical substitution is equal to technical substitution in terms of productive efficiency is equal to marginal rate of substitution of for the individual A and marginal rate of substitution of individual B. Marginal rate of technical substitution is the substitution on an isocont, while marginal rate of substitution is substitution along different goods of consumer baskets on an individual's indifference curve. When marginal rate of substitution of A is equal to marginal rate of substitution of B, that would represent that both of these individuals are at their Pareto efficiency, and when they were equal, in the end we concluded that that would be equal to the price ratios of factors of production and the price ratios of the products. In terms of a perfect markets, Pareto efficiency would be achieved automatically given certain prices of factors of production and prices of units of clothing and food. The Pareto efficiency would be achieved. Then in the end we came to a monopoly, where we expressed that in case of monopoly, a monopolist produces where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, but he charges price along the demand curve. Since marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve, and monopolist is a price maker and not a price taker, and his product is never have a close substitute, and there are barriers to entry. So those barriers to entry result into his monopoly powers, and he uses those monopoly powers to produce the quantity where MC is equal to MR and charge a higher price along the demand curve. That would mean the price being charged is higher than the marginal cost. So Then, since we have established the efficiency criteria for the markets, and then we would move on to analyze the markets in the next lecture, where we would see that what sorts of inefficiencies or failures in markets might take place, and how government can correct those failures, or even certain government actions might result into market failures. See you in the next lecture.